we don't make a deal with Canada, that's just fine. But we'll see how it all works out. I say affectionately, we'll just have to tariff those cars coming in. That's a lot of money coming into the coffers of the United States.
And affectionately here to react, Rona Ambrose, former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and a current member of the Canadian government's Nafta Advisory Council. There is so much we have to go through at the moment, but I want to just recap with the Toronto Star article coming out, pretty much publicizing leaked comments from a Bloomberg interview with the president. I want to read a tweet before I get your thoughts on it from one of those Toronto Star reporters. He's saying, what happened is I obtained these quotes. I'm not bound by Bloomberg's off-the-record promises. I asked the White House and the Trudeau team for comment. The Trudeau team, which is certain the quotes are accurate, sprung them on Trump's team at the meeting this morning. We do know afterwards that the president of the United States did essentially verify these tweets, saying that now he's happy Canada knows how he feels. You are a part of this team. You are in Canada. How do you feel, and how do you think Canadians are reacting to this? And is this what pretty much turned things around today with the negotiations?
No, I don't think so. Look, we have experienced a lot of tension over the last couple of days. Everyone was hopeful that we would come to an agreement by the end of Friday today, and we didn't. But that is not unusual in trade negotiations. There's a lot at stake. And look, your president, President Trump, is a tough negotiator, but I do think he wants to get to a deal. Canada wants to get to a deal. We do have more work to do, and I'm glad to hear we're going back. I'm also really glad to hear that Canada's part of the letter of intent going to Congress. I do think all three countries want to come to an agreement, but there are some tough things to still hammer out.
What about the no compromising? How is that beneficial to Canadians in negotiations if the president of the United States himself have said, I'm not going to compromise, take it or leave it?
You know what? It's not unusual to hear that kind of language in tough trade negotiations. I think what's unusual about it, and we've all become more accustomed to it with President Trump at the helm, is that it's in the form of a tweet, and it's much more public. I mean, in the past, trade negotiations have always been done behind closed doors, and we didn't see this kind of activity in the public. But I think we now know, whether it's from South Korea or the president negotiating on his tax reforms, whether it's with negotiations with Mexico or the European Union, this is the way President Trump negotiates. So I don't think Canadians are overly surprised that he will tweet, and he'll probably continue to put a lot of pressure on Canada leading up to Wednesday and even past Wednesday. But look, at the end of the day, Canadians want to get to a deal. I think President Trump wants to get to a deal. I think he's coming off a very positive deal with Mexico, particularly around the auto provisions, which are also good for Canada, by the way.
Wait, but let me interrupt, because you just had the president say that he will just follow through with those tariffs on Canadian cars. How is that for the market?
It's terrible for the market. It's terrible. And look, that is the big dark cloud looming over these negotiations. We want to get to a deal. There's no doubt about it. And if for some reason we can't get to a deal, I do worry that President Trump would impose auto tariffs on Canadian cars going into the United States. And let me be clear, that would devastate the Canadian economy. So there is a lot at stake for Canada. We're talking 100,000 jobs could be lost. This would literally devastate one of our province's economies and have a ripple effect throughout the entire economy. And you've seen what happened to the Canadian dollar as soon as it looks like NAFTA talks might be failing. But I do feel confident that President Trump wants to see those auto provisions succeed. Canada wants to see those auto provisions succeed. This is important for whether it's the labor unions or workers, both in Canada and the United States. I know we've got some tough stuff to hammer out in the next couple of days or week, but I do believe that we all want to get to a deal, and we'll get there eventually. But there has to be compromise on every side.
Is a division of CBS. Joining us now for some political analysis, Edward Wong is a diplomatic and international correspondent for the New York Times. Selena Zito reports for the Washington Examiner, is a columnist for the New York Post, and is also a CNN contributor. Margaret Talev is the senior White House correspondent for Bloomberg News. She's also a CNN political analyst. And Kelsey Snell is a congressional reporter for NPR. Welcome to Face the Nation. Ed, let's start off with you. Secretary Kerry there basically laying out his regrets about Syria. We know today the Secretary of State Now, Mike Pompeo is warning 3 million people are at risk in Idlib, Syria, of imminent disaster. The Pope is warning about this. The UN is warning about this. What is the Trump administration doing about it?
Well, the Trump administration officials say that various people like Pompeo, Mattis, have spoken to their counterparts and to Russian officials about this. But if you look at the Trump policy, it's not that different than Obama's policy. And so far, we haven't seen any action that would really push back against a large Assad military action or backed by Russians and by Iranians. And so I think that Assad won't feel a compunction to really hold back. I think Idlib province is the very last holdout of the rebels, and he's going to push ahead with whatever offensive he has lined up.
So despite the tough rhetoric against Iran, the group they're backing, and Assad, is winning this war, and the U.S. is not doing anything to stop this slaughter.
Right. I think that we saw Trump do a symbolic action earlier in his administration. He fired the missiles on the airfield in Syria, but that didn't hold Assad back. And unless there are tougher actions on Assad and on his allies, we won't see him holding back at all.
But they have warned, right, that they're willing to do that. And Bolton sent that message very clearly to
if there's use of chemical weapons.
If there are use of chemical weapons, that it would be not just equal to, but more significant than the previous attack. But it really is in conflict with the administration's desire to get out of Syria, which they've also been trying to negotiate, if possible, if the Russians are willing to make commitments about Iran. So these are two policy goals in real conflict.
You know, I had a former Obama administration official say to me, policy's not that different. We just felt bad about it, which is an incredibly cynical way of looking at what is happening on the ground right now. Margaret, I want to ask you just right off the top, the publication you work for, Bloomberg News, you just had an extended sit-down with President Trump.
It was amazing.
And it sparked its own controversy. The president now attacking Bloomberg for what he is claiming was leak of off-the-record information. Bloomberg's denied it. The reporter who printed it came from a different publication. You have not violated that off-the-record standard in the course of your comments, I know. But what can you explain to us about what happened?
And I should also add, the Canadian reporter also has said that without identifying who a source is, it wasn't us. So we had an interview with the president. We had talked to the White House and said, our readers have a big interest in the economy. We'd love to do this going into the Labor Day weekend. And they granted us an interview. We were supposed to go about 20 minutes. The president said he was feeling intellectually stimulated. And so we were thrilled to get about double the time. We had 45, 50 minutes in the Oval Office with him. And we covered, you know, the waterfront, basically everything from Nafta to North Korea to Jeff Sessions and midterm politics. And on the subject of Nafta, what he told us on the record was that maybe they get a deal with the Canadians by the next day, by Friday. Maybe it would be in sort of the near future. But either way, he was convinced that the Canadians would come along. I have no idea how the Canadian reporter got any information that he published. And because we honor off-the-record agreements, I can't talk about what the president might have said off the record.
But to be clear, you have a transcript of the full conversation, and the White House has a transcript of the full interview.
Yes.
So those are the two places where record exists.
Those are.
The specific place that the president confirmed these off-the-record comments, because he tweeted about them, the specific area was about Nafta.
That's right.
Policy-wise, where are we with that? Because just yesterday, the president let off a flurry of tweets saying he might, after all, withdraw from the agreement that his administration says he had intended to sign on to again.
Yeah, the president and the White House feel and say that they feel that they have the leverage over Canada ultimately going into this. But as you know, they've set off sort of this 30-day time clock because of the Mexican president, Mr. Peña Nieto's kind of expiration date in office. And they are trying to pressure Canada into signing on now to a trilateral pact or else forcing it into two pieces. And so he's got basically till the end of September to get Canada on board, right? To make it easy through Congress to make this happen.
Not just easy, it might be impossible to add Canada later if they don't get the final text to Congress within the 30-day window. That was started on Friday, and Congress has been telling the White House about this for some time, so this is not new information to the White House.
What's interesting is if you look at domestic politics in Canada, there's not a lot of incentive for the Trudeau administration to really sign on immediately. I mean, his sort of anti-Trump stance has been popular with the Canadian constituency, and they also have a bilateral agreement on trade between Canada and the U.S. that they can fall back on.
And the reason this matters is because this is such key trade to so many U.S. states.
Absolutely.
And
corporate executives have been pressuring the president for a while now. Keep this as a three-part deal, whatever you call it, or a lot of jobs, including in the U.S., could be a risk.
And you look at, the states that I cover, the Midwest states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, they're all stepping back and looking at this. This is a lot of the reason why a lot of these voters came towards him and in how he conducts these negotiations.
all right, we're going to take a moment and come back on the other.
President Trump is spending this Labor Day weekend at the White House with trade concerns likely on his mind. Trade talks between the U.S. and Canada hit a snag on Friday after a Canadian newspaper obtained off-the-record remarks Mr. Trump made to Bloomberg News. That raises doubts about the future of the 25-year-old North American free trade agreement. Paula Reed is at the White House. Paula, tell us all about it.
Well, good morning. Trump notified Congress on Friday that he intends to sign a renegotiated Nafta deal with Mexico. But the question now is whether Canada will also be part of that new deal. And after a week of tense negotiations, Canada says they'll continue to negotiate. But as of right now, there is no deal.
Canada's ripping us off. The whole world is ripping us off.
President Trump spent the day in Charlotte, North Carolina Friday, spotlighting tensions with Canada as he tries to fulfill a long-standing promise to renegotiate Nafta.
NAFTA was a disaster.
A bilateral deal was reached with Mexico on Monday, but talks with Canada have stalled over issues including NAFTA's dispute resolution system and access to Canada's dairy market.
I said off the record some things about Canada.
To make matters worse, the Toronto Star on Friday published some harsh words the president made during a Bloomberg News interview in which he said he would not compromise with Canada on a trade deal, but didn't want his comments published because, quote, it's going to be so insulting, they're not going to be able to make a deal.
Here's the good news. At least Canada knows where I stand, because we can't have these countries taking advantage of the United States anymore. It's very simple.
The president's remarks raised doubts about whether the U.S. was negotiating in good faith with Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau asserted he would not sign a deal if it hurt Canada.
We will only sign a deal if it is a good deal for Canada. Again, no deal is better than a bad deal for Canada and for Canadians, and that's exactly what we are remaining firm on.
Talks will resume here in Washington on Wednesday, but congressional approval is needed for any revised NAFTA deal. And leaders of both parties have said that both Mexico and Canada must be part of any revised agreement. Elaine?
Paula Reed at the White House. Thank you.
Trump says he is moving forward on a campaign promise to scrap and replace the North American Free Trade Agreement. But will it be a 2 or a 3-nation deal? Paula Reed is at the White House.
Big thing. Big thing.
Today, President Trump officially notified Congress that he intends to sign a renegotiated NAFTA trade agreement with Mexico.
We just made a great deal for both countries with Mexico.
The administration says the agreement will include Canada if it's willing, but negotiations between the two countries have stalled amid growing tensions. The Toronto Star today published off-the-record comments President Trump made to Bloomberg News, in which he said he would make no concessions to the Canadian government. It's going to be so insulting they're not going to be able to make a deal, he said. I can't kill these people. In North Carolina, the president did not deny the comments.
But I said in the end it's okay, because at least Canada knows how I feel. So it's fine. It's fine. It's true.
Renegotiating NAFTA was a signature Trump campaign promise.
And if we don't get the deal we want, we will terminate NAFTA and get a much better deal.
The talks with Canada have been hung up on issues related to cars, agriculture, and other sectors. This afternoon, Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland said there is no deal.
The government of Canada will not sign an agreement unless it's good for Canada and good for Canadians.
Canada says the two countries will continue to negotiate, and it has 90 days before the U.S. signs its new deal with Mexico. Now, some see this as a good sign that the president is negotiating new deals instead of withdrawing from NAFTA or resorting to tariffs. John?
Paula Reed at the White House. Thank you, Paula.
You will only agree to a deal that is a good deal for Canada. We're not there yet.
Donald Trump had threatened to cut Canada out of NAFTA if the Canadians didn't sign on to a new deal by today. But that hasn't happened. Instead, the president sent a letter to Congress saying when the talks finally wrap up, he's ready to approve a new pact with Mexico and with Canada if it is willing. The president was 600 kilometers from the negotiating table, but his presence loomed over the discussions. Trump had to defend himself after comments he made about Canada off the record ended up being published.
I made a statement about Canada, which is fine, because I love Canada. But they've taken advantage of our country for many years.
Trump said he would not make any NAFTA concessions to Canada, adding if he said that publicly, Canada would be too insulted to sign a deal.
But I said, in the end, it's okay, because at least Canada knows how I feel. So it's fine. It's fine.
Canadian negotiators confronted the U.S. about the comments, but later said that Trump's views were not being mirrored at the table.
Ambassador Lighthizer and his team have been negotiating in good faith and with goodwill.
That goodwill is going to be tested when negotiators sit down again next week. The U.S. is pushing for Canada to allow farmers to sell more dairy products north of the border, while Canada is refusing to back down on demands the U.S. drop its request to kill the dispute resolution system.
We have been very clear about where our red lines are. We've been very clear about where we think there's room for give and take. This is something that we take seriously as a renegotiation. We understand how this works. We've remained good faith.
The one thing that everyone agrees on, they're ready for a break. Negotiators tried to cram weeks' worth of work into 4 days, and they didn't quite get there, Rosie.
Okay, so where is Mexico in all this? Do they need to get back to the table at some point, too?
The Mexicans were actually spotted at the Canadian embassy for some meetings this afternoon, but they're not expected to actually formally re-enter the negotiations until Canada and the U.S. deal with all of their bilateral issues.
Okay, Katie, tools down for you for a little bit anyway. Thank you. That's the CBC's
Thanks.
Katie Simpson in Washington. The U.S. Capitol building, where much will be decided in the coming weeks after U.S. President Donald Trump sent a letter to members stating his intention to eventually ink a deal with Canada. The first big date to watch, this coming Wednesday, September 5th. That's when Canadian and American negotiators go back at it. The letter then says that over the next few weeks, members of Congress and business leaders should be able to have a look at the agreement. It offers no specific dates, though, and if all goes well, Trump intends to sign a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico 90 days from today, which is November 29th. Obviously, there are no guarantees of a deal at all. The Americans seem to be content to keep playing hardball, but Canada, too, has its sticking points. Chapter 19, NAFTA's dispute resolving mechanism. It allows countries to work out disagreements through a politically neutral panel. The Americans want to scrap it. Canada is adamant that it stays in some form. And there's the $20 billion dairy sector. Trump wants Ottawa to remove protections and open it up. But with over 200,000 jobs on the line and concerns of cheap American dairy flooding north, Canada is unlikely to budge. And then there's Canada's cultural industry.
They tend to see cultural matters, as in virtually everything else, as something that has a dollar sign on it.
It's never been easy to compete with a giant next door.
I was in full support of his proposal of free trade.
That's why Canada insisted on and won some key cultural exemptions during free trade talks back in 1987, like content quotas, government subsidies, and strict rules on foreign ownership. They automatically carried over into NAFTA, and they've worked well and helped launch successful careers. But as politics and technology change, are those exemptions in danger? Jérôme Payette is with the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, a group committed to protecting them.
If we go in a digital economy and for culture as well, and there's not any way to support our actors, our creators, our producers, our publishers, they will be in serious trouble because, of course, the USA is a powerhouse regarding culture. So they create a lot, very good content, that we cannot compete without any government support.
Just another sticking point for Canadian negotiators to keep in mind before talks resume next week. We're at the end of what has surely been one of the most challenging weeks of Justin Trudeau's government between NAFTA and the pipeline. The host of Power and Politics, Vassy Kapelis, joins me now. Vassy, I know you've been talking to people, reaching out to people in government. Give us a sense of how they're feeling tonight.
Well, hi, Rosie. There are a lot of concerns on the part of people I've been speaking to in government, not just about NAFTA, but especially about the pipeline file. That decision was a big blow to the mantra that they really got elected on and that we've heard so many times from Justin Trudeau, this idea that the environment can be protected while the economy can grow at the same time. And this court decision really provides the biggest test of that almost campaign slogan that we've heard over and over and over again. And people in government are concerned that they will fail that test. On the NAFTA file, I mean, there is some sort of mitigated optimism, I guess you could say, or cautious optimism. It's not the worst case scenario for sure. Things didn't fall apart, but it's also not the best case scenario. They didn't get a deal. And they're worried. Sources I've spoken to are worried about how far apart they are on some of the major sticking points.
Okay, so what's the plan to move forward if there is one?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. On NAFTA, even if they do get the best case scenario and there's a deal, they have to try and sell whatever concessions they make domestically, and that won't be easy. Mm-hmm. On the pipeline file, they have to figure out, are they going to appeal it or are they going to start consultations all over again? And sources I said, they feel like they almost have handed the opposition a gift 2 weeks out from Parliament resuming and, and a year out from an election.
Okay, Vassy, thanks for this tonight. Appreciate it.
No problem.
After a week of drama in Washington, this was supposed to be a quiet, long weekend for NAFTA negotiators to regroup. But Donald Trump has been anything but quiet. The U.S. president continues to tweet his frustration with the current agreement and with Canada for, quote, taking advantage of his country. Megan Roberts is following this story for us. So, Megan, remind us, what has President Trump been tweeting?
He repeated some of the same things that we've heard in the past, Natasha, saying that he loves Canada, proclaiming his love for the country, but also saying that the U.S. has been getting a raw deal at the hands of Canada. Let's bring up one of those tweets that he sent, by the way, on the way to a golf course during John McCain's funeral. Here, Donald Trump saying there's no political necessity to keep Canada in this new NAFTA deal. They're referencing the bilateral deal agreed upon by the United States and Mexico. He's saying that there were decades of abuse by Canada, and if there's no fair deal for the United States, Canada is out. And he also said that United States Congress, shouldn't interfere or he'll simply terminate NAFTA entirely, something that we have heard from him before, saying that threat to terminate NAFTA. So what do Canadian officials think about all of this? We don't know exactly. They've remained tight-lipped about this officially, as they have throughout the entire process, really. Canadian officials often saying that they're not going to negotiate in public. But sources did tell CBC that they've come to expect this kind of language from the United States president, that kind of language, that strong language, especially during intense periods of negotiation. They said certainly they take threats seriously, but that they think that this is the kind of pressure tactic during negotiations, Natasha.
So as we look ahead to next week, what are we expecting there?
Well, the negotiations will continue on Wednesday between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to try to make that bilateral deal into a trilateral deal. So getting Canada back to that table to try to make something work for all three countries. In that tweet we were just talking about, Trump said that Canada was not politically necessary in this deal, but there are many perhaps, that would disagree with him. And one of those people is Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO, which is the largest federation of unions in the United States. And he says Canada is necessary for that deal. Let's listen to more.
Our economies are integrated. The three countries in North America, the economy is pretty integrated. And it's pretty hard to see how that would work without having Canada in the deal. You said that the Mexican deal is closed. There's still a lot of work to be left to be done, even on the Mexican deal, Chris, because the language isn't drafted. We haven't seen whole chapters of the thing. We're anxious to move forward with it and anxious to have all three countries involved.
Trumka, by the way, doesn't support NAFTA, wants a new deal. And he mentioned that our economies are integrated. This map shows you why. All of the majority of that shade of red on that map represents Canada. Specifically, Canada being the single biggest trade partner for those individual states. So you can see how tied our economies are in this map. And Canada is America's second largest trading partner overall.
So looking ahead, for more on the NAFTA talks, we reach Lawrence Herman. He practices international trade law at Herman & Associates. He is also a former Canadian diplomat. Here's what he had to say.
Has descended to a dismal period. That's the reality, and we have to live with it. What do we do, and where do we go from here? That's the big question, and I think those are the questions you're putting to me.
Yes, so where should we go from here?
Well, you know, look, under normal circumstances, if you have those kinds of aggressive and frankly obnoxious statements by a party you're trying to do a deal with, trying to reach an agreement, showing bad faith in a major way, one of the options would be to walk away and just say we can't continue to negotiate under these kinds of circumstances with those sorts of threats, kind of a take it or leave it proposition. But I don't think Canada can do that at this stage. Maybe at a later stage, but at this stage, I think we've got to go back to the negotiating table and see what can be done. Frankly, I'm not sure much can be done, but I think the government has to give it another try and see what happens.
Okay, so sir, help me understand that. We're not in a position where Canada can walk away from the table, but you also don't think much is about to change, so what happens next?
Well, I think we can try to see whether there is some meeting of the minds on some of the difficult issues. And if there isn't a meeting of the minds, and there doesn't seem to be any flexibility on the part of the United States, Canada will have to make some very tough decisions. And those decisions will be giving in and compromising on some critical issues.
One person not in attendance at Senator John McCain's funeral, President Trump. First daughter Ivanka and the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner did represent the family after the McCain family asked the president not to attend. Well, the two men had long feuded with the president, claiming that McCain was not a hero because he was a POW. Instead, Saturday morning, the president was on Twitter where he slammed the Russia investigation and accused Canada of taking advantage of the U.S. for many years. Erin Delmore is the senior political correspondent at Bustle, and she joins me now. Okay, Erin, I actually want to start off talking about NAFTA. We know these talks are set to resume this week. The foreign minister of Canada has weighed in. I actually want to play a bite from her for you.
As we've said from the outset, our objective in these talks is to update and modernize NAFTA in a way that is good for Canadians, good for Americans, and good for Mexicans. We know that a win-win-win agreement is within reach, and that's what we're working towards. With goodwill and flexibility on all sides, I know we can get there.
So what do you think, Erin, the chances are that all three countries can come to some sort of agreement?
That's a lot of optimism and a lot of poise and grace from Chrystia Freeland of Canada, but it's not necessarily being matched by the rhetoric on the U.S. side. We've seen the Canadians come out and say, we're going to take our time. We have faith in the U.S. trade representative who is in charge of these negotiations. But we've also seen President Trump come out and put Canada on the hot seat. I mean, he has said, I'm not offering them any concessions. But he said in the interview with Bloomberg, I don't want that to get out, because then it will be very hard for them to take this deal. Mm-hmm. Now, presumably the Canadians know that they haven't been offered any concessions, so I don't know if that really moves the needle on negotiations one way or the other, but I don't think the big problem here is necessarily Canada and Trump. I think the problem is going to be Trump getting this deal over to Congress, because this deal, any renegotiation of NAFTA, needs congressional approval, and congressional Republicans are saying if Canada's not included in this deal, if it's not a three-way deal, we are not signing on board.
So what are the implications, Erin, if no deal is reached?
Well, the funny thing is, if you look very closely at the deal that's being proposed with Mexico, that doesn't very much change the trade structure anyway. President Trump took to the campaign trail saying, I will renegotiate NAFTA, a 25-year-old agreement, because it will increase American jobs and it will decrease our trade deficit with Mexico. But the deal that he's proposing with Mexico doesn't significantly alter either one of those two factors. But if a deal isn't reached with Canada, the president's going to have to go back to the drawing board, because remember, he's the deal maker, he is the author of the art of the deal, and he'll have to figure out something that pleases all three parties and can get through Congress. And the stakes are high, at least for congressional Republicans, because Canada is the main exporter for 36 U.S. states. So expect them to be feeling the pressure from their own constituents.
So this is definitely something that individual states will feel.
Absolutely.
Next week also we're going to be following on to starting Tuesday the Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh that the White House is putting forward his confirmation hearings. You said that it really rests in the hands of 3 women whether this goes forward. What do you mean?
We're looking at Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, both of them are Republicans, and Heidi Heitkamp, a Democrat from North Dakota. Now, the reason why these 3 women are at the forefront of all the conversation right now is because the 2 Republicans are the most moderate, and they've also said that they're pro-choice Republicans. So Democrats are looking at them and thinking if we can bring them on board, we might be able to stop Brett Kavanaugh's nomination from going through. Republicans, meanwhile, are looking at a handful of red state Democrats up for re-election in 2018 as their soft targets. And Heitkamp is the perfect example here, Rena, because her state went for President Trump by 36 points in 2016. That's a landslide. So she needs to basically thread the needle now and figure out whether she wants to vote in line with her party and oppose Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. That's the party line for Democrats. Or if she wants to try to curry some favor with her constituents ahead of her own contest. And President Trump took to the campaign trail in June, and he told that whole crowd in North Dakota that Heidi Heitkamp would be a vote against his next Supreme Court nominee. But that's a little funny because she was a vote for Neil Gorsuch, his last Supreme Court nominee. So she has been shown to be right in the middle here, and this is what's very, very tough. But if we want to point to Kavanaugh, there are going to be 3 main issues that come up for the Democrats. Democrats in the Senate committee are going to point out his stance on executive power, what he thinks about the Affordable Care Act, and Roe v. Wade, whether that's settled law. The best indication we have on how Murkowski and Collins could vote is that they've said that they are okay with Collins' statements, with Kavanaugh's statements, that Roe v. Wade is settled law. It's the biggest indicator yet of how they're leaning.
So when you break it down, do you think that his candidacy for Supreme Court could in any way be in jeopardy?
It's hard to see that right now. I think if we had tougher statements coming out from Collins and Murkowski, we could think that they might make more of an issue over his stance on Roe. They seem placated by him saying that settled law is what Roe v. Wade is. But legal scholars have been pointing out to me all week when I talk to them that settled law is precedential, but law can be overturned. That's a precedent as well that we see frequently. So the real question isn't whether he thinks Roe v. Wade is settled law, it's whether he thinks that law was settled correctly. And there's legal writings and spoken word in his past that shows that he thinks that the dissent was very well argued.
I also want to turn to the president's schedule next week. He'll be heading to Montana on Thursday to throw his support behind the Senate candidate, Matt Rosendale. What do you think the messaging will be for him in midterms, not just for Rosendale, but for the candidates he's backing across the country?
I think that his supreme confidence right now in the economy and in the way his White House is running is what he's going to be talking about on the campaign trail. Remember, Republicans really do think that the strength of the economy right now will bring voters in and have them vote for a status quo, consensus, Republican-led House and Senate. And they also think that the tax cuts could help lift up voters. Unfortunately, tax cuts is not resonating as an issue during the midterms the way that most Republicans hoped. A lot of those benefits didn't come down to American middle class and blue-collar workers the way that they had expected. So they're looking for other campaign tactics here. The biggest one is get President Trump on the road. He's doing some 40 campaign appearances just between August 1st and that first week in November, and it seems to be where he's happiest. He seems very comfortable. And when the Democrats throw out a line like a culture of corruption in the White House, he localizes all of the issues and talks specifically about angel families and illegal immigrants and what they have done in this country. He really knows how to fire up certain segments of America.
He's very gifted in that sense of reaching out to his base and knowing what really works with them. I want to ask you, though, what caught our attention here was this new Washington Post poll that actually shows that 36%, the president's approval rating has actually dropped to 36% at this point. Are we going to see Republican candidates embracing the president as we get closer to November? Sometimes the primaries are one thing, but then November is a different thing.
Yeah. Well, when I talk to the people who are corralling these candidates, the legislative campaign committees, some of the aides and campaign managers here, they say that they want to find the right candidate who fits the right district. So if it's a Trump-loving district, yes, you can expect them to go full MAGA on the campaign trail. But they tell me if you're looking at a purple state, they're going to sort of tread the line, try to find some arguments that resonate with the Trump crowd, but maybe not embrace some of his more robust policies. And they're also going to try to stay away from a lot of his personal issues, whether it's the women, the allegations, the payments, the Cohen and the Manafort. They really do want to keep any sort of personal issues, especially ones that are alienating suburban women, out of the conversation.
Erin Delmore, we always love having you on set, Erin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
How are things with the Canadians?
No deal, at least not yet, as the Trump administration renegotiates NAFTA. The catch? Canada.
We will only sign a deal if it is a good deal for Canada. Again, no deal is better than a bad deal.
U.S. and Canadian officials hitting an impasse, failing to meet a Friday deadline set by the White House. President Trump now signaling he might leave Canada out in the cold. Tweeting today, "I love Canada, but they've taken advantage of our country for many years." The president demanding concessions.
If we don't make a deal with Canada, that's just fine. But we'll see how it all works out.
U.S. officials are set to continue trade talks with their Canadian counterparts this week, having already reached a tentative deal with Mexico. The U.S.-Mexico agreement calls for auto companies that build their cars in Mexico to use more American-made parts to avoid tariffs. Good news for U.S. factory workers, but could also raise car prices. Trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada flaring. U.S. home builders aiming for a rollback of the 20% tariff the Trump administration slapped on Canadian lumber. A price hike hammering builders and buyers hard.
You've got people that are right there at that line of qualification, and so when you tack on, an extra $8,000 or $10,000 to the home, you price a lot of those people out of the market.
Replacing NAFTA requires congressional approval. Since Canada is the largest trading partner for some 36 states, some members of Congress already saying, no Canada, no deal.